Welcome back, everyone, to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. And today it's not just Pinedo Brothers, it's also Pinedo Brothers plus Pinedo Sister. Annie, welcome back.
Hello,
I'm JP, your host, and we have Peter.
Peter in the house.
Today we're chatting about a topic we've long promised we would return to, the What is Art podcast. And why is it important to us? Well, first of all, Peter and I are working on a feature film right now. And I think it's important as artists to keep your eye on the North Star and say, what are we trying to do here and why are we trying to do it? But on a deeper level, are there other reasons why maybe some people in our audience should care to know what is art? We'll turn it to Peter real quick. Peter, why do you think, is it important, and if so, why, for maybe non-artists to know what art is?
Well, I think that art essentially is a part of culture, and you are a consumer of art, whether you mean to be or not. It's important to have some conception or idea of what you're consuming, because oftentimes what you end up consuming as art is not really art at all. But like kind of how we discussed in the past is actually it's propaganda. I remember we did that one with Casey. That was about the music, right? We listened to different songs and kind of compared and contrasted. Is this art or is this something that's pushing a message on me? There's a lot of films, especially as filmmakers. There's a lot of films out there today that are being sold as art, but have nothing to do with art at all. And they're collections of opinions that the creators are pushing on you, and that is really has nothing to do with art or the artistic pursuit at all. So I think it's important as people and members of society to have an understanding of what is and isn't art, so that we're not led down these paths and of consuming things that are detrimental to us and detrimental to society.
Agree, 100%. So this is a very front of mind topic this weekend. We had the Barbie movie come out. And what you consume has a direct impact upon you. And if you don't realize what you're consuming, it'll have an even greater impact upon you. I think back, the Barbie movie actually makes me think back to Leni Riefenstahl, whom I've spoken to in the past, who is one of the greatest directors of all time, probably the greatest female director of all time. She was a Nazi, and she made propaganda films for the arch villain Hitler.
Third Reich.
Yes. She influenced a nation by her work. It wasn't art because it was very clearly a propaganda film. If someone wants to point to a propaganda that anyone can agree upon as propaganda, you think back to the Nazi propaganda films. And Leni did it better than anyone else. She inspired a nation, probably more directly than anyone else did that worked in the Nazi party, to follow this hero of hers, Hitler. So if we, as a people, as consumers, can no longer pick up when someone is piping down an idea that could be, I think propaganda could be good propaganda. I don't think it's necessarily always bad. But suppose we cannot recognize propaganda when we're getting fed it, we're setting ourselves up for failure. Just like the German people set themselves up for an incredible failure that was the Third Reich. So I think it's incredibly important for us to be able to, not just as artists, which we want to follow our North Star like we talked about, but also as consumers, be able to pick up and say, okay, this Barbie film, is it just a satire? Or are we trying to teach women to hate men? Are we trying to teach women to do things that will be destructive to themselves because we're miserable? Which is kind of the propaganda that you pick up with this film. In any case, let's talk back to something a little bit. Let's go back to something a little bit more positive here. What about the argument that's all, someone could say, well, it's all subjective. Your art is my propaganda. My propaganda is your art, so on and so forth. Peter, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think what we kind of came to earlier in our last episode that we spoke about this, we did kind of come to the conclusion that there is a sense of objective art. There's a sense of, just as we as Catholics believe that there's a sense of objective truth, we do believe that art has to do with the truth and the good, the true, and the beautiful. Obviously, that's a very Catholic answer, so we'll have to, pick that apart a little bit more to get to something that's more common ground to non-Catholic audiences or non-Catholic artists. Because obviously you don't have to be Catholic to be a good artist, but it's the pursuit of that truth and the pursuit of beauty that art is intrinsically tied to. In certain senses, living in today's society, actually, it's really easy to answer that question, because right now there's a stark contrast between art and the propaganda, because what is being presented as true is very often obviously not true. And what is being presented as quote unquote beautiful is playing to the, you don't even have to be virtuous anymore to see what's being presented as beautiful is not beautiful.
I love that. That's great.
It's really easy to see. And so I think that if you're speaking to just, today's audiences, all you have to do is point in the vast majority of things that are being produced. Oftentimes, okay, that's not art. You can tell it because it doesn't make me, it's not beautiful. It's not remotely true. And it's not leading me towards anything that seems healthy or good for myself, or good for society.
I think that the argument for beauty could be distinctly Catholic, and I want to circle back to that. But what you're hitting upon something is universal right now, which is art. One of the attributes of art, and we're going to dive in and define what art is. We'll have to, but what we'll say, what I know, what's on my list is that it points to some sort of truth. And so therefore, if the piece that you're creating points to an anti-truth or to an untruth, as if it is true, then it is not art. And therefore, it must be propaganda. So there is because the artist must cleave to the fact that there is truth, then it holds that there is objective art as well as objective propaganda. That makes sense to me. Annie, what about you? What do you think? What do you think of that argument, though, that it's all subjective?
I agree, going along with what Peter is saying there. It's kind of like you can have something good, but that doesn't mean maybe you necessarily like it, but you can agree that it's something that is good. And that's what you can find in art. Maybe rock music, you don't like it, but there are some certain rock songs out there that convey a message of truth or of goodness. And doesn't mean that you have to listen to it because it's good, but agree that it's pointing in the direction of truth.
So you used a couple of terms there that I confused me a little bit. So when truth, I understand. It's like it's apparent to me what truth means. But when you say good, what would that mean when it comes to art?
Good, as in directing you towards truth.
Okay. So if it directs you away from truth, it's bad.
Away from truth, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I get that. Makes sense. I can get on board with that. But then it wouldn't be art, right? So therefore,
exactly,
truth is not good. Okay. I mean, if something is not good, then it's not art.
It's not art. Exactly.
I'm on board. Okay, let's dive right in. Let's rip off the Band-Aid. So we've dismissed quickly with why this is important and why it's not subjective. Let's go for definitions. I'm happy to go first. I sketched out three points that I think all art should follow. Would you mind if I jumped in first?
Go for it,
please.
Okay, great. So first point that I had, art must accept limitations in order for it to be art. It must accept parameters, just like Chesterton talks about the painting must be contained by the edges of the frame or the edges of the canvas. Therefore, art has to have some sort of form that it follows. Now, form can be broken from time to time, but it cannot be broken to some point where the form is no longer recognizable. For example, a film needs to have frames in it, or else it would not, there's no film for it. It needs to have image followed by image. It's a series of moving images. And if it doesn't have moving images, then it's not a film. So same thing with painting, same thing with music. Music follows a limitation that the artist accepts in order for it to be created. And I think that gets much more complicated as your artistic endeavor becomes more sophisticated. So composing a symphony has an incredible amount of rules that you need to follow in order for you to have a good symphony, one that follows the form of a symphony. It's not quite as complex with a movie, like directing a film. However, films have symphonies within them. So maybe it is even more complex because a film is an amalgam of a lot of different art mediums. So it follows the form of the medium would be my synthesis of that first point. The second thing I wanted to bring up is something we've already spoken about. It achieves some measure of revealed truth. You have to follow that which is true and then try to imbue it in some way into your art. If you do not do that, then it is not art. So an example that I had of this was thinking about, this is a very Christian idea, but thinking about God. So God creates art. He's the original artist. God creates man. We as man and woman reveal God because we are made in God's image. So therefore, the art that he makes us reveals himself, reveals truth. Same thing can be said of a great dance, a great film, a great painting. It reveals some sort of truth. The last thing I have down, and I'll be glad to submit all of this to you all. It's a two-way street. So the idea that I had was that art cannot be created in a vacuum. It needs to have some sort of ability to connect with someone outside of the creator, outside of he who creates, outside of the artist, and then that have a reaction, an interpretation that lives on apart from the creator. So that's a really important thing. I can't tell you what to think as you are taking part of my artistic endeavor. If I'm telling you what to think, then I'm ruining that connection. I'm dominating you. An example that I have of this is another Catholic example, like with the Mass. So when the Mass is said, it can only be said if there is some congregation. I remember back in college, one of our priests who was from India, who would always love to say Mass, called me up asking if I could join him to say Mass with him, because he hadn't been able to say Mass yet that day, and he couldn't say it on his own, but he wanted to celebrate Mass. And so just like Mass needs an audience in order for Mass to be said, so too does art require an audience in order for it to be art. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to have an audience immediately. Like it could lie dormant for centuries and suddenly be discovered, and there's a connection with it. An example of that would be Tolkien. Tolkien, when he wrote Leaf with Niggle, he was fully expecting that he was talking about Lord of the Rings, and he was fully expecting that Lord of the Rings would be torn apart, and no one would ever no one would ever take part of this. But when he wrote Leaf by Niggle, he said, years from now, someone will take a little leaf of paper and it will go in a museum, and then people will come and look at that leaf. And then it becomes art at that point, is what I posit, because someone is coming and taking part in it in some degree. So those are the three things I would say. So it's a two-way street. it achieves some measure of revealed truth, and then it embraces limitations. What do you all make of that?
If I'm understanding you correctly, there's kind of three major aspects. There's form, truth, and function, right? There's it has to exist within the bounds of certain set of rules. Then it has to do with something that's intrinsically true. And then there's function, that it communicates to an audience. I think what I was also hearing within that definition of function was there's a social aspect to it, which I think is really interesting point to make, because obviously as human beings, we're inherently social creatures. No matter how antisocial you are, you still need some type of human interaction in order to be fully and truly human. And so I think that in many ways, art is kind of the fullness of being human, is because that's kind of what you're saying right there. And that's kind of what to me, it kind of sounds like you're getting at, because those are the three aspects of what being human really is all about form. You're following this certain set of rules that guide your life. And then there's the truth that you live by, and then there's the function and the functionings in society, and that social aspect of being who you are, existing in the family, existing in your community, existing in your country. So I guess within my question for you then would be, within that set of rules or set of criteria for what art is, does that mean that like is art just paintings, films, music, or can art also be, let's say, living your life? Can living your life be a form of art, or does that not fit within that definition?
I think it's possible. I definitely think it's possible that a life could be lived artistically. I don't think it happens accidentally, because one of the things that the first point I was trying to get at is that it's something that you think about, you do purposefully. It's like there's a sense of gathering, that you put into your art. So I think it's
there's design, right?
Yeah, definitely. So
intentional design.
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible especially with the definition that I made. I'm not 100% sure exactly what it would look like. Do you have an example, a thought that you could throw together?
With following those set of criteria with intention, like you're saying, that kind of describes a lot of the lives of the saints, for example. I think that also describes the life of someone who lives for God and for their family. I think that fits within that set of criteria. But I'm just wondering if this is too broad, if this is too vague of a definition, that you can even include life itself as art, because I don't want that to fall into that trap too, of just saying everything's art.
Well, maybe just point more about that art has its limitation, and it has its form within that limitation. I think that might kind of put a little bit of parameter on not calling life actually art.
Yeah, I don't think your example of a life of a saint would work for me. I don't want to just say out of hand that it's not, that a life lived artistically could not be a work of art. But I think part of the first point that I was trying to make is you have to go out to set out to do something that's a work of art. Like there must be an intent there. And I think with the lives of the saints, as far as, that's a very broad term. There's so many different saints, but by and large, the lives of the saints, They're not setting out to do a work of art. They're setting out to practice their religion, to bind themselves to God, here and in the afterlife. So I don't know. I think if there's something more specific, then I'm open to it, but I don't think just the lives of the saints is doesn't have enough specificity there. I think I would answer your, it might be too broad by saying you might be too broad.
It definitely makes me think that there are many different mediums and ways of creating art, and I think there are ways still unthought of communicating
Sure.
Art. But what you were saying about the social aspect especially really resonated with me, because I think, oftentimes when it comes to painting, I'll think of Van Gogh, and he had very, little to no audience for his creation, for the art that he created. And yet we still, look up to it and love it so much today. And I remember when I went to see a gallery of, original, Van Gogh pieces, there were a few in there that really moved me. And I think this might be an interesting point to what we were talking about, because it wasn't at face value extremely beautiful. It was an extremely beautiful piece. What it was a painting that he did while he was at a sanitarium. Because he was, we've spoken about him in the past. He was mentally imbalanced, and he had a lot of, mental battles that he had to fight, ultimately kind of losing. But he did this piece, and it really resounded with me, because in looking at it, it was a picture of this kind of very gnarly, twisted kind of forest. And there was one solitary figure who was sitting by the tree, and he was kind of gnarly, twisted, looking like the tree. And it wasn't ugly. It wasn't like gnarly and twisted in an ugly way. It wasn't, difficult to look at, but it definitely drew you in and it communicated a type of story. I felt like I was kind of hearing a piece of something that Van Gogh was saying, something about himself that he was saying, that really spoke to me, and it was very moving. And so in that way, I think it was beautiful. But what would you say to something like that, where itself is not at face value extremely beautiful, but kind of communicated to me a kind of beautiful truth?
Sure. Well, I don't think that necessarily all forms of art have to follow the strictures of beauty, like aspiring to be what is beautiful. I think probably the highest forms of art do, and I want to get into that later when we're speaking specifically about what is Catholic art. I think that has a much higher bar when it comes to beauty. And we can talk more about why or why not. That might be the case. But as far as my initial definition of art, I don't think necessarily beauty has to be a part of it. I think it has to have truth. So it has to have some sort of revealed truth. And in that way, ultimately, it has to be beautiful because it's revealing some sort of truth. And truth is not ugly, at least the way that we understand truth. So but what I'm trying to say is I don't limit it. Like wouldn't limit it to say, oh, well, Van Gogh painting is not art because it's not really beautiful. Beauty is not one of my things that I think it has to be a part of. What do you think, Annie?
I disagree with you on the term, but I think on the point I might agree with you, because for me, art has to be beautiful, but it doesn't mean it doesn't mean it has to be beautiful at face value, as Peter's saying, mentioning. It's more beauty and is as in having harmony. So in which case, that's where the beauty of this Van Gogh painting Peter is talking about is this harmony that it had within the painting and the gnarliness that somehow went together that portrays this sentiment. And so deviate but come to the same point in the end.
Start going about it a different way. Well, tell me, is there a more specific definition that we can come up with, Peter or Annie?
I think it's difficult really to say. From me, I think I would. It's difficult for me to say from a very purely secular kind of point of view, because I think oftentimes if I'm trying to make a definition that's has to do with art, my faith is so. I know as a Catholic filmmaker and artist, that faith is very intrinsically tied to my conception and ideas of art, and so that's why I would struggle to communicate it to on the level where it's acceptable to non-faith-based consumers or artists. Other than that, I do think, like what you were saying, is that it's intrinsically tied to the truth. I do think what I would say, aside from the aspect of the faith, is that kind of what I was getting at earlier, what I was getting from what you were saying, was that art has to do with the things that make us the most human. Those three aspects that you were saying, the form, the truth, and the function. Those types of qualities are present in the animal kingdom, present in nature, but only realized in humanity. And so I think that if I was going to be discussing art or really trying to communicate my idea and conception of art to someone who would not accept, any idea of religion or Christianity more specifically, I would say that it has to do with communicating what it means to be human, through a medium that can be seen, as you were saying, and appreciated by others, that is not telling someone how to think, like you were saying, but still resonates with the audiences because it is communicating a truth about humanity that they as humans can also see and internalize and understand themselves without you ever having met them or them knowing who you are at all. Obviously, Van Gogh died a long, long time ago. I don't know him, but yet I understand a certain aspect of who he was as a human person because I'm a human person and I'm able to recognize his humanity in what he created.
Makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think our definitions are really close. I think I'm curious to see how you would further define it from a Catholic point of view, but let's pause there. Annie, what about you? Is your how would you take this definition?
I see art really as it's a harmonious arrangement of a certain aspect of creation. And in order to be harmonious, it needs to direct the viewer towards truth. And I don't mean direct as in, stuffing it down the throat. You have to think this way, but just that's what your work is based off of. And so I guess also there I'd kind of coincide with Peter in his reflection over this aspect with humanity, because I mean it's usually it's this representation of what you see in creation. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I'd broaden it a little more, but till it could be, but in the end, it's going to be a human person, a viewer that's seen it, who will be connecting with it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like the addition of the word harmonious. I think that the first point that I made, I need to incorporate that word into it. The harmonious shaping, the form that is harmonious it embraces the limitation of a form that is harmonious, something like that. Because I really like,
I'd go with that.
I really like that word and how it describes.
Yeah, that's awesome, because that's not it's not a limitation. Harmony, I don't see harmony and harmonious structures as limitations, because they're fluid. Harmony makes me think of fluidity. And so that way it's not strictly structured, and it has to fit within these lines.
Yeah. Well, I guess
but it has
exactly
to make harmonious sense. And so I love that addition there.
Yeah, I'm responding though when I say limitation to the, like, very closely with music actually, by saying, all those composers that create atonal music because tonal music is too constricting, or all those artists that say they don't want to follow the rules of whatever their medium is because the rules are too constricting. My point in saying that embracing the limitation is not a pejorative at all. I have a view that the more that an artist accepts limitations, the better his art becomes, the more refined it becomes. Obviously, there are reasons to break rules. There are reasons to break conventions. Atonal music from time to time works to great effect. But atonal music could also just become the same note played over and over, which is Tolkien's Morgoth and the Silmarillion. So you can't get away with that either and then call it art. So embracing a limitation is not a pejorative sense to me, but it's kind of responding very closely to those artists. I want to like very clearly wall them off and be like, no, you need to accept limitation. That which you say is limitation, at least. I don't view it as something that's bad, but I want to be very clear. Does that make sense why I use that word?
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe it's to my own detriment to the detriment of the definition, but I get so frustrated with that. Okay, with that whole thing, I just don't want to be limited. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Limitation is what allows it to be art.
Can I ask you a quick question though, based on that note, and we can just dwell on it for a second, and then we can move on. Are you familiar with Ludwig? I don't know how to say his last name, Göransson or something like that. He did music. He's a composer. He does a lot of movies. He did, I think the one that I'm thinking of right now is the music for Tenet, Chris Nolan's film Tenet, which is, extremely chaotic movie for one thing, but also extremely chaotic music. And yet there's a lot of pieces in the movie Tenet that I like to listen to, and I just listen to, for fun. I don't know, would you describe that as atonal, and would you describe that as too much off the mark? Because to me, it kind of seems that he is still following a set of rules, as he seems to be he's turning music upside down on itself, but by doing that, he's doing the exact reverse of the rules. And so in a way, he's still following the rules, if that makes sense. What would you say about music like that?
Well, I don't know this composer. I'll check him up afterwards. So I'm not sure. I would say an example of someone who doesn't create art, and this is probably pretty controversial, is someone like Schoenberg. His atonal music goes too far beyond what should be accepted, like what form and harmony is, like the definitions of form and harmony. Schoenberg goes beyond. Bela Bartok from time to time goes beyond. Bartok, if you've seen the movie The Shining, he was the composer for that, and he did a lot of other things. Anything where the form is not recognizable, then I think you go too far. Now, I like a lot of music that has a lot of atonality in it, so I might like this composer quite a bit. I like Philip Glass quite a bit. I even like some Bartok. Let me see, who are some other atonal composers? They're kind of slipping my mind right now. So I think everything is a case-by-case basis, and nothing is. I find there's some things that is very difficult to like say definitively when there's artists like the Tenet composer. I'm assuming he's a very good artist, like he knows his stuff, and so he can straddle that line, and that's a beautiful thing to be able to straddle that line. But something like Schoenberg, he falls on the other side. There needs to be some sort of recognition of form, and harmony, and embracing of some sort of limitation. Humorously enough, if you decide to throw away limitation completely and just do your own thing, that's some of the most constricting works of they're not art, works of unart out there. Sometimes, it's just one note that's being played. I mean, how limiting is that? So it's a weird paradox there. If you don't embrace the limitation, then you oftentimes become incredibly limited. You impose even more limits upon yourself beyond what the form demands, what the form of your medium demands. So it's some weird paradox there that
it's a good point.
Understand how.
Come to think of it, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that you brought up Schoenberg, because there's this one particular piece of his that I cannot remember the name of it at this moment, that I kind of like to listen to, because I find it rather fascinating, but I can't listen to even the whole piece at one time because it always makes me pretty depressed and sad. And so I guess it kind of goes to show something about, I guess, this lack of harmony in the work, and not by, I mean, you can have disharmony in a piece and that's still harmonious in a way, but lack of harmony in the work, we'll say, not in the music itself, that can lead you away from truth, it seems.
Well, we need to get a composer on this podcast, because something that, I took music theory back in college. You all know that. I'm just saying that for the audience. So one thing that I've always been very passionate about is how music theory, the theory behind the score, influences the film. And I think that with the film that we're working on now, the Socrati, please pre-order now on the link below, because every pre-order is a boost to us at this point. So our upcoming film, the Socrati, is a horror film. Atonal music takes you to very dark places, like you were saying, Annie. So if you are in a dark place, I think an atonal score works very well. So I think our film needs to have a lot of atonal places. So Peter, let's you and I talk about that after this, and we'll get Caleb in on that. The point that I would make is that if your film is going to follow some sort of form, I think it needs to resolve at the end. Especially, let's say, I'm willing to jettison that for the broad artists out there, for the artists that any will fit in any category. But if you're a Catholic artist, I think that it needs to resolve in some way. There needs to be some sort of resolution where it doesn't end atonally. Even if it's a tragedy, there is some sort of sense of justice, even cold and bleak justice, like The Shining.
That have to do with its connection with the human experience.
Yeah,
I mean, nobody wants to just be left on edge. You want there to be an ending, even if it's not what you were hoping for.
I think
no one likes being left in the air.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. So I think a Catholic artist will need to find some sort of harmony at the end, a Catholic filmmaker with his score, even in a horror film. If you want to follow very closely to what is art, especially for a Catholic artist. Let's dive into that. So Peter, how is being Catholic influence the definition of art?
Again, kind of coming from my own experience and more in my own I guess worldview when it comes to art, is that so we'll take it back to high school. When I was in high school, I got an Instagram, because it was what the cool kids did. But it had in a lot of my friends in their Instagram bios had everyone put little description. You're supposed to put something to tell people who you are and what what's important to you. And a lot of people would say, so I had a bunch of Catholic friends, so I had, would say, nature lover, dog lover, Catholic, something like that. And that never ever sat well with me at all, because to me, I saw that as listing your faith, your Catholicism, as something that is a part of who you are, as an attribute of who you are, on par with being a dog lover and a nature lover, So to me, my faith, however imperfect it is, because obviously it's extremely flawed. If you read the Unfollowed, you see a picture of faith, but you see a picture of faith that is very broken and very flawed. And so, as kind of fitting within that definition of art that we were saying, that more universal kind of secular idea of art, as describing something about yourself to an audience, describing a human truth. I think that, to me, that my human truth that I'm communicating is my faith. And so every work of art that I'm creating, or piece that I'm making through whatever medium that is, through, writing a novel or drawing something, or creating a film, and hopefully someday creating music, it's communicating my faith, because that's how I see myself. But it's also communicating the flaws and the cracks within that. And so I think it's one way of misunderstanding what I'm trying to say is that it's preaching, because obviously it's not preaching, and I have a passionate dislike of any kind of art, or supposed art, that is just preaching at you. To me, it's kind of communicating an idea of God that is not who God is necessarily, but it's how it's the striving to understand and see God for who He is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Annie,
Mm-hmm.
how is the definition of art different for a Catholic? Or maybe it isn't.
Mm-hmm. I think it is, because at least for me, it's that, being a Catholic, my faith is what influences everything that I do, and what motivates me, and things that inspire me have to, go along with with leading towards God, and so it's just kind of be reflected in all that I do, really.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think you both are very close with your definition, that it is reflective of your faith.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be nitpicky, but here goes. How is that different from, like, the Barbie movie? That was very reflective of this anti-man faith, this very feminist faith. It's reflective of very well of a third wave feminist.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the thing was that the whole question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The first thing I'm thinking is that when I'm creating or trying to create a piece of art, I am not trying to, for one thing, I'm not trying to make you agree with me. I'm not trying to make you or force down this narrow conception, my own narrow conception, nearsighted idea of God. I'm communicating what I'm able to see, what I feel, through this lens of striving for truth, beauty, and goodness. and I'm trying to be able to portray something that I see in the best way that I possibly can, to the fullness of my capacity and my ability. But I don't want you to, finish the last page of the book and just agree with every single view and idea that I just expressed. Right. I'm not wanting that. I want you to be able to be a part of the world that I'm creating, to feel like you experienced something that was not just thinking about my worldview.
Love it.
That opened it opened a window to a world for you, and you were able to participate in something that you weren't just spoken to, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does.
It's like works like the Barbie movie kind of touch on again what BJ or you were mentioning about with like how this atonal music ends up being so much more limited because they tried to get rid of limitations. It's like by them just trying to shove down your throat this message, like they close themselves off from so much potential what they could have done in their movie. Like they could have, what many people were hoping for, just given this big, huge visual explosion of what millions of girls have played with growing up. But instead, they decided to just limit themselves to this one point they wanted to drive home. And I mean, I agree with Peter there, as like with my art as well. It's like I want the audience to experience feelings. And that's something I find so fascinating and fun about making art, is that that each person is going to come away with something different. But you put out this possibility in front of them that they can take in so many different ways. And that's just fascinating to do.
Love it. Okay. So there's two things here. So with your definition that I'm taking away with is, one, it imparts a picture of your faith without being propagandistic. However, what I'm also taking away is your faith, there are characteristics of your faith that must come through. Like there are very specific characteristics. Truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, truth is a characteristic that's not only part of the Catholic faith, but beauty must come through into a greater degree. Goodness and truth are very closely aligned as far as we've defined it. Beauty comes through much, much more deeply. I would also argue that another characteristic of your faith is faith, hope, and love. So it's hard. I do not think you can be a Catholic and create art and then have it completely hopeless, or to have it completely devoid of the characters having faith in the end of some sort. Same thing with love. And then another key characteristic that I think is important to add is that Catholic art is imbibed with deep symbolism, deep and pervasive symbolism. For example, I was watching Monuments Men recently. The wife and I was watching Monuments Men, and it's amazing how it's just a decade or two old, and there's no way this film could get made now. It's a George Clooney flick, and there's no way it could get made now. It's probably less than 2 decades old, and there's this scene, this incredibly scene where one of the characters, played by Hugh Bonneville, is from Downton Abbey, is at the feet of a Madonna and Child, and he's writing to his father. He's writing to his father, who takes the place of God here, writing a confession, basically saying, "Father, I'm so sorry to have disappointed you. I want to do better. And I'm at the feet of the Madonna and Child as I say this." And he says, "I look up at the Madonna and I feel like I can do better." It's this incredibly symbolic moment. And then the next minute, the Nazis come in and they shoot him and he's dead. But he dies a good death. And that's a huge plot point of the movie, which kind of takes George Clooney on his little quest. And That is an example of symbolism. There's this deep, deep history of symbolism that is in Catholic art. Madonna is one of them. That the Madonna and Child is a huge part of it. The Rosary is a huge part of it. The Eucharist, confession, all of these things that then a Catholic consumer can recognize this language. It's a language that must be used in every bit of art that a Catholic artist makes. And if he doesn't utilize that art, that language, then his art suffers for it because he's a Catholic and he needs to use it, or else he's not taking part in his heritage. There's an idea that you have as a Catholic artist that you are following a long lineage. I think it's part of any art, really. But especially as a Catholic artist, you must remember that you are part of a long lineage of artists that have come before you who have used these languages, like the Madonna and Child, like the Sistine Chapel, like the Gothic cathedrals. All of these things imbibe your cultural heritage, and you must not only know them, but then be able to bring those sensibilities into what you do. There's a sense of continuity as a Catholic artist. So there's these characteristics of your faith that I think make what you're communicating when you're saying your faith something much more specific than whatever the Barbie movie could be. Well, actually, maybe not much more specific. Let me change that. Very different from what the Barbie movie could be. I think the Barbie movie could also be very specific faith, also not art, but still, it's a very different translation. Being a Catholic artist and thereby imbibing your faith or speaking about your faith, when it takes on all these characteristics that I've just mentioned, it makes it something very specifically different than something like the faith that's found in a Barbie film. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to a little bit in that the idea of trying to throw off the quote unquote shackles of any structure or rules, and in the end being more limited by a new set of rules that you've imposed upon yourself. Because who was it that said, those who don't believe in anything will believe in everything. This new modernist religion that has arisen in our culture and society is more restrictive, is more oppressive, has more little inquisitions throughout all of our country and our society than Catholicism ever had, than Christianity has ever had, than any, almost any other religion in history. And so this new religion that has arisen is more oppressive. In the end, when we here created it ourselves, we raised this stone idol, thinking that if we will worship something that we created, we'll be more free because we created it. But in the end, it's more restrictive and oppressive than we could have ever dreamed.
It's like you put yourself within a prison because, when you're trying to convey truth, it's truth leading to God. That's something bigger than humans and humanity. And so you're able to elevate thought higher than that's what you're trying to do. Whereas you throw that away, then you're just keeping yourself within a box and your whole audience as well.
Yeah. Okay. So last question here. Does the definition of art change throughout the years in y'all's mind?
Definition, I'd say no. The interpretation can change, but the definition, no.
So is that kind of how Van Gogh was not appreciated? When you say interpretation, like the audience is interpret it different.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or I think of like Rite of Spring and the changes in music throughout the years.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah, Rite of Spring, old Stravinsky. he
Mhm.
probably wasn't appreciated as an artist back then. Maybe the fact that I'm such a traditionalist means that I wouldn't have appreciated him as an artist. But now looking back, I can say, okay, I can see what he was, how that follows some form and function. Well, I enjoyed this conversation very much. Any final thoughts from you all?
I think it was very great to have you, Annie. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
It was our
Pinedo
pleasure.
Siblings doesn't have quite the same ring to it, but it's still great to have you.
No, it doesn't. Pinedo Bros and Sis is just weird too. So.
Yeah. But in the meantime, also, everybody check out the Socrati. Every week that goes by, we are getting closer and closer to creating our next feature project, horror film, a Catholic horror film.
It's gonna
Going to
be
be
big.
pretty crazy. Yeah, so I'm super excited about it. And as the weeks go by, continue to stay tuned, because there's going to be more and more coming out about it. And just be a part of this journey with us. We want to make you a part of this film. And so, keep coming back to this podcast, keep following. And there's a lot of awesome, really cool things that are coming down the road.
Amen to that.
Mm-hmm.
So just to leave with a final thought on what is art. It is not just an obligation. It's not just an obligation, but it's something that is intrinsically tied to what it means for you to live fully alive. Like the vision that John Paul II had of a man fully alive ties in to appreciating art and then carefully selecting that which you have in your home, which includes the movies that you bring in, that which you bring into your mind as the home of your mind. So I hope that you were able to take something from this. I think I was able to, very much so. Thank you both. And I hope that the listeners were able to take something from this. If you were, please leave something in the comments so we can learn more from what you brought in into the home of your mind, because I'm sure that'll help expand the conversation more. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. We postponed it because the arrival of our twins. So again, thank you both, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.